One, it's Shashi's birthday, so unfortunately we're missing the big man, and Anthropic took away his favorite toy over his birthday week. Damon and Shashi discussed the Anthropic debacle on Saturday, and it's recorded, but I ended up not being there for that. I'm curious to just hear what the general like consensus was, like the two-liner, I guess maybe.
Yeah, I think the general consensus, I mean, two-liner to your point, is that a lot of this is still being decided in real time. Therefore, not that many conclusions can be made
Mhm.
right now. I think the thing worth emphasizing and maybe just prompting you to get your thoughts on it is, to me, what this does more than anything else is we've been discussing on this podcast a number of times around how various folks from different camps, depending on who you talk to, have very firm opinions and sometimes polarized firm opinions on where the current state of AI is. Meaning, on one extreme, you have folks that are saying AGI is here, we've reached takeoff, etc. You have folks on the other side extreme saying, "What is Claude? I've never heard of that." And what this does, in my mind, is it offers some version of third-party validation that a line of demarcation has been
Mm.
crossed. There is now the pre-Fable models, of which none of them were deemed important enough to have an export control, and there's the post-Mythos Fable world, in which now one of them at least has. And so, I guess just starting there, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, so if I wasn't intending on talking about this, I actually rather forgot that I brought up this thread. In my head, there's a distinction between like what is the model and what is like the harness, like where the value kind of is there. And I think a lot of people have felt this like AGI-esque thing because of the harness specifically for the coding use case, right? That's not to like discount that Mythos and Fable have both shown really good benchmarks on like biology, spatial reasoning, stuff outside of the coding domain. But we kind of refer to this that like if you have a computer driven problem, that is a thing that's generally solvable by software. And a thing that's recursively rewarded to solve software problems is just going to continue to expand. I think the speaking for the little bit of Fable I did try, in my head, I have been the sort of like category person that like I will let these things spin for days on end. Like historically, it's felt that way. Um, I think what the way I look at the line of battle sort of being drawn around Fable, um, I kind of assume there's a lot of mixed incentives here, like allegiances, like which corporations are on whose side, like the kind of like people have called for slowdowns. That has been a thing. That's not a new thing. But it's the first time like a slowdown has truly come. And when I look at the reason for why, um, I think it is a generally I think we've been on an exponential for a long time. I think for the first time, if you zoom out enough, the exponential's like perceptible to the average person. I think that's a mix of how Dario and co have been marketing it. Like I think like there's just been more fear-driven paranoia that's been building up over a longer time. You mix that in with the way people kind of like hate AI and hate LMs. Um, I think like it, it's not just a capability touch point. Like if we looked at what the model could do is very impressive, but it's not like so much of a hop in the ways that we're used to. It's just you mix that with the cultural tone shift that has been happening around AI. You mix it with like a large significant model that they're like especially scaring people about with the rollout and all this kind of stuff. And you're just creating like a media event potpourri that's kind of asking to be very, very dramatized, you know? Um, I will say, I was very, very impressed with the model, though. I mean, like, again, how much is harness, how much is model? Hard to kind of say. But at least in my usage of it, like, it is the sort of thing that, like, let run for as long as possible, give spec as well defined as possible, move on with life has felt like the right policy for developing.
Yeah, I think you've nailed it in the sense that my experience has largely been driven by anybody interacting with these models in a way that is not Codex or Claude Code or Claude Cowork, just has a very different, I think, opinion of them than the power users that are working inside of those harnesses, as you call
Right.
them. Like it's just folks that are, I think, completing real tasks of productivity in those apps are just having a very different experience than the folks that are still limiting themselves to the chatbots, kind of those ecosystems. And so I do think that is kind of where the perception divide, um, yeah, is the largest. I think that's right.
Yeah, I will say. I mean, so like a different conversation, like on the other end of government takes your model out like boots on your skis. Like as a business development process, the thing that's really interesting to me to just like watch. I don't have a conclusive view on it yet, but Anthropic for the longest time has like done this sort of like spook marketing into rollout that drives a lot of hype, and then they'll like increase their model limits when that sort of thing happens, right? We were in a period where like Fable is not supposed to be reachable to people by like API, but they're letting people with subscriptions use it up until the 22nd. Now, for whatever duration of time, however long it takes them to resolve with the government, it sounds like Dario's meeting Trump. Um, there is a lost window of hype, effectively. And that's not to say that like there's going to be a model that catches up or something similar. But I know speaking for myself, like I have been flipping between codecs and cloud subscriptions. I just keep going back and forth. There's nothing binding me to one of those products except for whoever just has the hottest model at the current moment. Um, and with that, I, for example, my cloud subscription is gonna like expire and go back to like a 20, while my codex was up to a 200 on the 24th. And without Fable, right? Like I've been pretty happy with codex. I don't feel incentive right now to flip on again, right? Where I think there's a weird trend here of the model marketing, I think, that feels a little bit more vulnerable than before, given that like external environment all of a sudden shutters the cycles of predictable market, like turn, churn, CAC, all that sort of stuff that I don't think is precedented historically.
Yeah, my additive thought there is the lead is now Anthropic's to lose, whereas basically this is the first time that that's been the case. Whereas before, before Claude Code certainly, so maybe going back to like Opus 4.5, give or take, it was OpenAI's lead to
Yeah.
lose, and being the number one business product, etc., in a market, you just get more arrows slung at you, for lack of a better term. And like this is, I think, just the problem, right? Like before, OpenAI had kind of been pioneering, so to speak, and stepping on the rakes that Anthropic could miss because OpenAI stepped on them first. Now
Right.
Anthropic is like in uncharted territory. They're going to step on a lot of rakes, and then we'll just see what the fast follow behavior of OpenAI becomes. Uh, I think you're right. I think I've purposely, in my own work patterns, built in redundancy such that in the event I couldn't access one or the other, I hit limits or whatever, I can switch between them. That does actually bring up an interesting talking point, though, that I'd be curious to get your thoughts on. In my workflow, there's basically now only one point of non-redundancy, and that's GitHub. I guess you could
Yes.
argue local, but
Yeah.
like I just like as a realization to me that I was thinking about, I'm like, because I've also seen graphs where effectively the number of commits on GitHub has gone up
Mhm.
exponentially since, which is I think matches intuition, but I guess the direct question I would throw to you, and like again, kind of apologies for a tangent, we can come back to the Anthropic thing, but do you think this just makes GitHub infinitely more valuable, given that
I mean,
again it
that
feels like the only point that like I'm just not going to move off of?
it's the whole thing about like I mean, when you look at like what is the moat in the whole like model era, like people will say like I mean, you make the argument about like the data processing systems. Like some people still say system of record is the core thing. Like GitHub, very simply, is a file system of record, right? Which gives them immunity in like the truest case of like build a thing that your agents use, like build a tool that agents use, and there's no version of the current moment that a agent chooses to store its files in something that's not Git, or at least like functional files. I I think I know some people who are working on they're trying to make like an agent first Git. I don't really know what that means, but there's like a bunch of ideas as to how you make like a token driven development process more state management friendly. Um, but it is like evidence into like what moats exist directionally, where I don't think there's a universe that like Git stops being a core primitive of agentic development. Like it's really, really hard for me to make a compelling argument why someone else could come in and not be the coding system of record.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I haven't really thought through the implications of if that is true. Like if GitHub is one of the most lasting kind of
Yeah.
points nodes in this value chain. I haven't really thought through the implications of that, but it did occur to me as I was going through all this and like just in observing my own behavior and talking to other folks like you who seem to have uh, affinity for a certain subset of models or model providers, but not necessarily
Mhm.
affinity for a single one. Um, like my subscription charges are the opposite of yours. I'm 200 on the max plan on Anthropic and 20 on Codex, just because I
Mm.
lean Claude Code first. But honestly, that's more code work related than it is
Mm.
just the one to one comparison of
Has that
Claude
always
Code.
been true, or is that in reaction to Fable or Mythos?
That's always been true. It's been
Okay.
true since like January, so for the last like six
Okay.
months or so.
I see.
Like the addition of co-work is what did it for me because I spend a good chunk of my weeks, not necessarily daily, but certainly weekly, making other things that aren't code, like
Right.
PowerPoints or PDF reports and those kind of things. And I always start in co-work for that
Hmm.
because it's just easier to edit and create new file types that aren't code in co-work than it is
Yep.
in Claude Code. So again, that's
Yeah,
that's
that
yeah. Go ahead.
that's one thing. I mean, like, our like argument wise between the product layer, I have found that same thing that like for productive work that's not code, I end up in code co-work anyway. That I'm still kind of up in the air about like my Claude subscription generally. Um, I am finding that when I'm in co-work, I end up like manually dropping the model intelligence very firmly most of my time that I'm in co-work. Pod code then gets like all of the pumps and gas. Codex, I don't really have like a rule for when I start using it. More so that just like certain projects kind of lend themselves to like that sort of like intense multi-threading, for which having like a really good GUI has been more valuable. Um, Kind of moving on. SpaceX, not too much to comment on beyond kind of what we talked about last time. Still on the run up, which is pretty exciting. You put out a really funny tweet about having a volcano layer in case SpaceX works, which is really, really funny, but I wouldn't put it past it to actually have happen. Um, did you have any more like vision on SpaceX since we talked about it? Like anything novel or same?
Not really. I think the only additive thought
Okay.
is that the more the price climbs, the sooner some of these potential buying events from the
Mhm.
indexes, like from the retirement managers, happen. And so it's obviously too early to comment, but over the next couple of days, as we record later in this week, I think it's going to be interesting to just keep track of which retirement managers actually activate which ETFs this thing ends up in sooner rather than later if the price continues to climb.
I see. Cool. Um, Yeah, only other stuff on mind. I think between the SpaceX and Anthropic, like the only stuff that stuck out as kind of interesting is Mistral, which you kind of alluded to. I don't know how much mileage we'll get out of talking about it, but if you want, maybe like lay that up and maybe a little bit of like the YC stuff that may be coming tomorrow and
Yeah,
vibes as you're going into it.
yeah, happy to. Got some time. So I think on the Mistral front, the interesting part to me is we've basically seen two different cohorts of model providers be successful in one way or the other. Those are the very well funded American frontier labs, i.e., OpenAI and Anthropic, and open source Chinese models, right? Some others
Mm.
open source and some other spheres, but basically those are kind of your two camps. Mistral is this interesting kind of third rail test case as I perceive it because it is effectively state sponsored. It's kind of the large language
Yeah.
model provider of France and maybe even the greater EU, although I don't actually know that to be true. But what is curious to me is they to date really haven't kept up, which I think probably says more about the talent dearth that's there than anything else. Because in theory, they have the resources they need. Maybe they don't have enough GPUs. Again, unsure. But to me, that's the most interesting thing. Is like, is there a third rail that is not incredibly well capitalized or incredibly resource efficient and possibly full of espionage? Because there's also some reports that open source in China and elsewhere may have already distilled Fable. So
Right.
again, TBD on that one. But for the Mistral point, I guess the interesting thing to me is not necessarily the model capability itself. It's just that can we have a third rail? Can something else
Right.
besides the two leading horses, if you want to call them that have dominated so far? Is there some other contender?
The argument I really liked about like how you build a frontier lab is all about like context capture. Like, can you like get into a really gnarly space that is hard for other people to enter, and can you hold on to the context there? That's what's happening between Anthropic and OpenAI and coding right now. The thing with Mistral that's interesting, like it's both an argument for and against, is that Europe just has such strong labor protections, data privacy laws, that like even the premise of context capture is really limited, right? Like fundamentally, you can't look at what Anthropic and OpenAI are able to collect in the general world and being in SF and kind of dominating that environment as comparable to what a Mistral EU first model is allowed to do. At the same time, because they're kind of naturally embedded in the EU, I think that there's some opportunity that like compared to Anthropic or OpenAI, like if they're compliance first, there seems in my head some opportunity that like, for example, they're as you said, they're kind of state sponsored. Does that give them more opportunity to get into like governmental context, like very, very compliance first, like build up that recursive flywheel that we're seeing happen now with coding in a novel domain that we have yet figured out. Oh, Shashi wants to join in real time. If I can click
Nice.
this button. Uh, oh, you
Yeah.
want to know
Wait.
something fun? Yeah, go ahead.
Shoot. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, with the software we're using to record, the button to hit accept on Shashi's request to join is blocked by a different icon, so I
Oh no.
can't. Um,
Oh no. Nice.
um, whatever. I'll tell him after. But the anyway, yeah, what you were saying, you were probably gonna reply to the compliance thing.
Yeah, I think my only thought to this is I think you're possibly right in the sense that maybe because the model is compliant by default, that will more quickly have it onboarded into certain either government applications or otherwise. I think the point that I keep returning to is in a world in which intelligence is an advantage for those that
Hmm.
have it. You wouldn't want second best. So even if it's
Right,
the most compliant, but it's less capable, I just don't think you can operate as a nation state that way. I don't think you
right.
can operate. Like, no one is like, sign me up for the fourth best, intelligence agency, right? Similarly, I don't think anyone's gonna, at the kind of the most important decision levels. I just don't think anybody's going to be opting for inferior performance on that particular article.
We're talking Mistral, Shashi. Welcome, happy birthday.
Mistral, wow, thank you, Mistral. Where have they been? Europe is just not investing enough to be a serious player, in my estimation. But is there some new finding about Mistral? Have you used it?
No, that was pretty much it. Lakshay was making the case, not really the case, but making the, I guess, opening the question of because Mistral is somewhat state sponsored and compliance first, given kind of EU's um, lean towards kind of safety and user privacy and that kind of thing, would they be more quickly adopted into confidential spheres, whether it be kind of EU government, etc.
I saw this hilarious post about Mistral a few months ago where Emmanuel Macron announced that France would be investing an additional $40 million
Yeah,
dollars
yeah,
or something.
yeah.
It was the most hilarious thing as like hyperscalers are investing like trillions of dollars. They come out with like a $40 million investment in their semiconductor space.
Yeah, for the record, I'm not like. I mean, I think slowing down the flywheel voluntarily is just a losing strategy. I agree fundamentally with Damon. I'm more playing like some levels devil's advocate. Like, is there an argument there? I think like the best case I can come up with is that like there's a bunch of very fantastic research not in the software engineering domain that comes out of Europe that whether it's pharma, whether it's like biological sciences, whether it's like gigantic like accelerators, right? There's all sorts of stuff in Europe that like we're not there yet. We're seeing all of the flywheel getting spent on coding right now. That it's not likely to me, but I imagine in my head there's some possibility, but that by being EU worker protection aligned, data compliance first, all that kind of stuff, that they get regulatory capture in the EU environment and maybe get an early start on some of that directional flywheel. Is that true? I don't know. I can't imagine that like what is happening with Anthropic and the government right now in the States is really exciting to like government in Europe, for example, as like we want to start adopting Anthropic into like XYZ use cases?
I mean, I love the Europe conversation. I think there's a future in which Europe is a lot more like Korea or Taiwan, in that Germany has some very good engineering companies that are more in the hardware space. There's a UK company that I'm an investor in called IQE that is in the wafer space that is really interesting. There is a company in France called Soitec that is also in this epi wafer space that is really interesting. I think this is the future for Europe. If I were to design a really successful future for Europe to participate in this semiconductor revolution, data center revolution, it would be to focus on the hardware and the engineering and not try to win the model space. The model space is the most likely to be commoditized, and I know we have a divergence of views here, but if you look at the spectrum of where value can be added, the model is only one of many places in which the semiconductor industry is going to create a lot of value. I'll give you some specific instances. So one of the bottlenecks for both data and electricity, for power for electrons, is copper. Copper is the limiting factor for power going into data centers. These bus bars are these massive copper-based wires. You can improve electricity by going to 800 volt, which is what Jensen has proposed for the entire industry, to move to 800 volt, which is, imagine the electricity is like a river. The power is the current times the voltage. The current is, imagine like the volume of water in the river, and the voltage is the speed, the velocity of the water. And so one of the ways to move the entire industry, which is what Jensen's proposal is, to move the entire industry to 800 volt. Well, if you do that, there are lots of new supply chain opportunities to participate in that, some of which are in Germany, some of which are in France, some of which are in the UK, et cetera. And so I would propose Europe focus on addressing and winning the bottlenecks there. Another is optics. So there are some really interesting companies. I'm a shareholder in a company called Wafers in Sweden that is an optics, pluggable optics into co-packaged optics company. Why use optics? Because you can get more data transfer through light than you can through copper. Copper is becoming the bottleneck within the rack. So and so you can use optics to win an important part of the supply chain that will accrue value, regardless of whether models have value or not. If you just leave that question aside, there are lots of other places in the supply chain where you can create value.
I mean, I think that the general argument, like in alignment with most of what you're saying, like I think that applies to most people, not just Europe, a little bit. Being on the supply, like we know where the bottlenecks are. They're seldom in the case of like we need more researchers who can figure out like the token questions on my GPU. It's what we need to figure out, where the hell are the GPUs coming from. That I think is more broadly applicable beyond Europe. It's just Europe has a good industrial base, is effectively what you're saying. Yeah,
that's right. And potential, if they just focus there and not try to win the model. Korea is not trying to win the model game. They're trying to produce memory. SK Hynix is an incredibly valuable company that is trading at a very cheap multiple and will continue to grow because memory is a key bottleneck. So there are lots of places. Taiwan's another example. Taiwan's not trying to win the model game. They're trying to win the accelerator GPU game, and they're doing it. They're crushing it.
Yeah, my only, I guess, comment is the challenge that I see for Europe, speaking in kind of generalities, just given the, thesis that you just outlaid, is their capital markets aren't prepared to take on that kind of hyperscale growth at the hardware layer. It's too expensive. And what you end up seeing for most of those companies that win down the hard tech lanes, they kind of end up using capital as a weapon. They raise very fast. They hit increasingly like important technical milestones because just of a rapid rate of spending. And the European capital markets aren't built for that. Like you do get some like one or two breakout cases, like ASML being the famous example, but that was because they were early in the expertise before the market demand was there. I think the challenge with a lot of those companies is that everyone knows those bottlenecks exist. And so there's increasing demand from the largest capital suppliers in the world to fund competitors. And so I think the question I would ask is not whether or not Europe should, but if they could, can they actually meet the capacity to do that in a world that is increasingly like capital intensive?
I mean, I went to Deep Tech Week last year. So Deep Tech Week is like mid June. So next week is Deep Tech Week again. I went to like, mind you, like this is like way out of the conversation we're having. It was like I went to like a nuclear talk, like a VC view on like the nuclear space kind of thing. And someone had raised a question about like why is there not more investment going into Europe, for example, for nuclear? And the example that the VC just like very plainly says like it's easier to like bootstrap a company from raw and like Alameda than it is to like try to like get a company going that has like EU worker protections basically in Europe. Which is so fascinating. Like I don't know like how you create like an innovation forward economy, but I was just saying there like mind you like 26-year-old who like barely understands anything. I'm just saying like that's a really strange like cause effect thing for why like a whole like section of the world is untenable for pushing forward a certain technology effectively.
The EU has
I,
really handicapped itself with its constraints, self-imposed governmental protectionist constraints. It's the exact opposite story of Texas. Texas
Yeah.
is America's growth engine
Yeah.
because of the exact opposite reason of EU's constraints, which is Texas is kind of the Wild West in a certain
Yeah.
respect, but it makes it very easy to build a business. You saw Elon come to Texas, Starbase is in Texas, um, and there's an enormous amount of growth. Data centers are growing enormously right now. The leader of data centers in the U.S. is Northern Virginia, Data Center Alley, but Texas is likely to overtake Data Center Alley in the coming years because there's just so much land development, power development. There's so much less regulatory burden and hurdle. These things are all going to get done anyway. So the question is,
Hmm.
how fast can we get them done, and where do they get them done, and who wins when they get done? And so you're absolutely right. That Texas is leading because of its low regulatory hurdle, in the same way that Europe is holding itself back from progress. It's only going to hurt their pension systems. That's fundamentally they've got a pension system that is unsustainable, and it's a huge financial burden on their system. They're unable to open up their government regulatory book because they have to continue to finance massive pensions.
do we want to pivot and talk early stage hardware, given the weave there lecture that you prompted
Yeah.
a minute ago?
Sure. Talking about
So
YC.
yeah. So I think there's a couple of things interesting, like thematically for YC, which for those that are unfamiliar, YC is an accelerator out of San Francisco, the San Francisco Bay Area, and their demo day is tomorrow. And so they run 4 batches per year. It's roughly 200 companies per batch. And what I find the most valuable about YC, other than just kind of the excitement and enthusiasm there, is they tend to be very they tend to be a leading indicator for what's coming. Meaning, like because you get a cross section of 200 companies, you get kind of these broad strokes themes where the earliest stage builders are building, a lot of which never actually come to fruition. Right, they're ideas that kind of never become reality, but a good number of them do. You know, why OpenAI being one of them. Call sheet being one of them, trying to think of things that really led, like Coinbase, right? These things that like really led transformational technologies. A good fraction of them do come out of YC. And one theme that has been consistent in the previous 2 batches is hardware startups, hardware, hard tech startups with increasing revenue capture in very short lifespans. And so I'm maybe just pause there for some specific questions, but I just really think it's number one, informative of what is coming, but then also number two, to the conversation we were just having, um, revenue capture, this idea of like capital as a weapon coming out of the earliest stages, like the acceleration on the in the growth paths that we're seeing there is remarkable in the literal sense, like outlier growth in a a small cohort of rapidly accelerating hard tech companies.
Yeah, I don't know. Like for me, like heart having grown up during like and like you know I grew in the age of people that like we watched Social Network and saw Uber and all this sort of stuff. Like the sort of like flywheel of early stage software is very obvious, and like the transition from what AI has done to it is still logical, right? Like it's still ultimately like build and sell effectively, and build is just a smaller step now. Um, what I don't have a good grasp on is how like I ask this almost with like a vested interest, mind you, like just like trying to understand for myself because I don't know these stories. Like, how is it? How is like pre-seed done? If these companies are achieving such high revenue ramps, like what are they doing in their first 3 months of birth? Or like how do they get to the point that their revenue is ramping so suddenly?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's also good context for anybody that might be listening that's thinking about building in the hardware space, right? Anything besides software. The very direct answer to your question is they're providing some level of market validation that isn't actual tangible revenue dollars sometimes, right? Because they're kind of promising to sell something that doesn't actually exist in full capacity yet, right? Like they're kind of promising to deliver drones or robots or um, power reactors or something like this. And like the reality is those things aren't fully built yet, but the way that they do it is they sign letters of intent, some sort of memorandum of operating agreement, these kind of things, where it validates market demand without actually having dollars changing hands. Now, the obvious implication of that is that those shouldn't be treated like real dollars, right? The revenue ramp of a software company that's actually generating real dollars is different than the revenue ramp of a company that isn't commercial yet, but has LOIs. But in hard tech, in hardware, that's okay because they can progress through technical milestones using the capital they raise towards commercial uh, viability without having realized revenue. And that's not to say that the companies in YC don't have realized revenue. Most of them do. But I'm just saying in a world in which they can't have actual realized revenue, they substitute that with like LOI based revenue.
So have you found, I mean, like in recognizing the world moment we're generally in, do you find that a lot of these companies are starting product first or market first? Like, are these LOIs generally found because they're going out and like pitching something that like doesn't have a obvious question attached to it? Or is it vice versa where it's just like, I found the DOE has these 7 contracts. I have an engineering solve that maps from that to that. I just went and filled it.
Yeah, selecting between just those two options, it would be more the latter, meaning there's a
Okay.
very clear demand either from the market itself or from government or otherwise that this is the thing that we need, right? Like using an example that we've discussed many times, the state of warfighting has fundamentally shifted, beginning mostly in the Russian-Ukraine conflict, continuing into the conflict in Iran and the Middle East and those kind of things. And so what you ended up with, right, was this massive economic asymmetry where 300 to $3,000 drones were being shot down with $1 million missiles, right?
Mhm.
Very, very clear incentive there to fix that problem. So there are certain companies, again, not speaking specifically on any company in this batch or previous YC batches, but there are several companies that some of them we've looked at in the earliest stages that say like that's the problem to be solved. We have a proposed solution to that, and then those companies are going through pilots with various stakeholders, whether it be the government or otherwise, to test the technologies they're building for technical milestones.
I see. So when you're at demo day, like, are you in, I guess, like, is the general tone that these folks have like prototype tier development? Or are they like, I guess, like, what's the benchmark of seed beyond just the revenue numbers, technically?
Yeah, good question. It's a lot of founder stuff. How qualified is the founder? How much
Okay.
money can they raise? How competitive are they in the marketplace? And then specifically on the prototype point, like the government uses technology readiness levels, TRL levels,
Mhm.
and so you can even in simulation environments for a lot of these things, it can't be like revenue generating. Yet you can get a stage of how far along the prototype journey are they because that's fairly standardized. Meaning
I see.
TLR7 is more advanced than TRL5 as an example, and you can
Okay.
kind of put arbitrary, benchmarks, market comparables in those categories. Like, let me give a very clear example. Um, Oklo is a fairly famous small nuclear reactor company that's public. They're valued at give or take billions. So it
Mhm.
depending on the trading day, right? So it could be somewhere between $5 and $10 billion as an example. They don't have any revenue, none. So that company went from startup to IPO with $0 in realized revenue. So that's just fundamentally a different paradigm than software companies, right? But the reason they did that, or the reason that they were able to do that, is because they had milestones along the way. And to be clear, I haven't looked at Oklo specifically. I didn't see them in the private markets. I just can know based on the research we've been able to do that the way they accomplished that was by achieving technical milestones on kind of agreed upon gates with the relevant stakeholders, whether that be data center buyers or the government or, like even states like New York or Texas, as Shashi was just outlining. Like they're buyers of these kind of energy producers as well.
I see. Interesting. Cool. So you're up there. I know Shashi joined late, so you're getting abridged attendance, but hey guys,
Give me half credit.
Yeah, you'll get half. I mean, no, that half credit's not worth that much these days, man. We'll catch y'all later, where we'll be following SpaceX and what keeps happening with Anthropic over the course of the week. So stay tuned. We'll catch y'all later. Peace.